On Sunday, the 15th of August 2021, the world watched in disbelief as the Taliban swept into Kabul after nearly 2 decades in the shadows. In a matter of hours, the capital of Afghanistan, a city that had seen empires rise and fall, once again came under their control. The United States and its allies had withdrawn after 20 long years of war. And as foreign forces packed their final helicopters, the Taliban moved with precision, reclaiming the city without firing a shot. It felt sudden. But in truth, this moment had been in motion for decades, an echo of a story that began long before the War on Terror, long before 9/11, even before the Cold War itself. This is the story of Afghanistan, a story of empire and endurance, of faith and blood, of a land that defied every outsider who ever tried to shape it. This is the story of the Taliban. Chapter 1: The Shadow of Empires. In the 19th century, Afghanistan was not yet the Afghanistan we know today. It was a land caught between 2 giants, the British Empire in the south and the Russian Empire in the north. To the British, the mountainous land was a buffer zone, a wall protecting British India from Russian influence. To the Russians, it was a frontier, an opening toward the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. This struggle for influence became known as the Great Game. The British, fearful of Russian expansion, invaded Afghanistan not once, but twice, each time believing they could control it. They never truly could. The First Anglo-Afghan War in 1839 ended in humiliation, with an entire British army wiped out in the mountain passes. The second, in the late 1870s, forced Afghanistan to cede parts of its sovereignty, particularly its foreign policy, to British control. But maps drawn in London and Moscow meant little to the tribes who lived there. When the British established the Duran Line, a border cutting through Pashtun tribal lands, they created a division that would haunt the region for generations. Families were split, tribes divided. To the Pashtuns, the border was meaningless. They had lived there for centuries, long before foreign diplomats decided where one empire ended and another began. By the dawn of the 20th century, Afghanistan had become a pawn in someone else's chess game. A landlocked nation dependent on foreign trade routes, its independence existed more in spirit than in reality. But that spirit, fierce, proud, and unbroken, was about to rise again. Chapter 2: The Struggle for Independence. In 1919, after years of frustration under British influence, King Amanullah Khan declared Afghanistan's full independence. The British resisted, and thus began the Third Anglo-Afghan War. It was short, but decisive. By 1921, Afghanistan had secured its sovereignty. It was now free, at least on paper. Amanullah was a reformer at heart. He believed Afghanistan could modernize without losing its soul. He introduced education reforms, supported women's rights, and sought to centralize power away from tribal and religious authorities. But Afghanistan was not ready for such a rapid transformation. Rural leaders revolted, accusing him of betraying tradition. And so, after only 10 years, Amanullah was overthrown. His modern dreams were replaced by the old order once again. The years that followed were turbulent. Leaders rose and fell, often through bloodshed. But amid the chaos, one truth remained. Afghanistan resisted control, even from within. When King Zahir Shah took the throne, in 1933, Afghanistan entered a rare period of relative stability. Under his long reign, the country began to open up cautiously to the outside world. Schools were built, roads were paved, and a constitution was written. But Afghanistan's deep tribal divisions still simmered beneath the surface. And when the winds of the Cold War began to sweep across Asia, those divisions would be tested like never before. Chapter 3: the Cold War and the Red Storm. By the 1950s, Afghanistan found itself once again between two global superpowers: the Soviet Union to the north, the United States and its allies to the south. King Zahir Shah tried to balance between them, accepting aid from both sides. But when his cousin Mohammad Daoud Khan became prime minister in 1955, he leaned heavily toward Moscow. Soviet engineers arrived building roads, airports, and dams. Soviet military advisors trained Afghan officers. And slowly, Afghanistan drifted closer into the orbit of the Red Empire. In 1973, Daoud Khan overthrew the monarchy and declared a republic. He promised reform, equality, modernization, progress. But he ruled with an iron hand, and within 5 years, his republic was gone. In April 1978, a group calling itself the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, staged a coup, assassinated Daoud Khan, and took power. They promised a socialist paradise. Instead, they plunged Afghanistan into chaos. Land reforms angered tribal leaders. The new regime's anti-religious policies enraged clerics. And when protests broke out, the government responded with violence. Villages were bombed, dissidents executed. The Afghan countryside erupted in rebellion, and the Soviet Union, watching its allies spiral out of control, decided to intervene. On Christmas Eve 1979, Soviet tanks rolled across the border. The invasion of Afghanistan had begun. Moscow claimed it had been invited, that it was there to restore order. But the world knew better. The Red Army had come to keep Afghanistan under its shadow. For 10 long years, Afghanistan became the battleground of the Cold War. The Soviet Union on one side, the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, on the other. And behind the Mujahideen stood the United States, Britain, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, funneling weapons, training, and money to those fighting the Soviets. Chapter 4. The War of the Mountains. The Soviet-Afghan War was unlike any other. The Red Army controlled the cities, but not the mountains. In those mountains, the Mujahideen became ghosts, striking, vanishing, striking again. They were poorly equipped at first, armed with old rifles passed down from earlier wars. But soon, Western weapons began to flow in. Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, became the middlemen. The war turned Afghanistan into a cauldron of violence, a place where ideology and survival became the same thing. Villages were destroyed, millions fled across the border into Pakistan and Iran, and for every bomb that fell, more young men picked up guns. In 1985, the U.S. introduced the Stinger missile to the battlefield, a weapon that would change the course of the war. Suddenly, Soviet helicopters, once the masters of the sky, became targets. The Mujahideen learned to shoot them down, and morale among Soviet pilots plummeted. By the late 1980s, the cost of the war was unbearable. More than 14,000 Soviet soldiers were dead, tens of thousands wounded. At home, the Soviet people were tired. Their empire was cracking. And in 1989, after 10 brutal years, the last Soviet troops withdrew across the Amu Darya River. They left behind a broken country. 1 million Afghans dead, 5 million displaced, cities reduced to rubble. But the end of one war only opened the door to another. Chapter 5. Civil War and the Rise of the Taliban. When the Soviets left, Afghanistan did not find peace. The factions that had fought together as Mujahideen soon turned on one another. President Mohammad Najibullah, a Soviet ally, tried to hold on to power. But when Moscow collapsed, so did his support. In 1992, Najibullah's government fell. What followed was chaos. Kabul became a battleground once again. Warlords carved up the city into zones of control. civilians were caught in the crossfire. By 1994, the Afghan people were exhausted. That's when a new group appeared, one that promised to bring order, justice, and the rule of Islamic law. They called themselves the Taliban, meaning students. Most were young men who had studied in conservative religious schools, madrasas, in Pakistan. Many were refugees from the war, orphaned by decades of conflict. Their leader was a one-eyed cleric named Mullah Muhammad Omar, a veteran of the fight against the Soviets. The Taliban's message was simple. We will end the war. We will purify the land. At first, people welcomed them. The Taliban fought corruption and punished bandits. They disarmed warlords and opened the roads. In a country desperate for peace, their discipline looked like salvation. With Pakistan's support and weapons and funding from Saudi donors, the Taliban expanded rapidly. By 1996, they had captured Kabul. They declared the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and Mullah Omar became its supreme leader. Chapter 6: The Emirate and the Dark Years. When the Taliban took power, the world barely understood what was coming. They imposed a harsh version of Sharia law. Women were banned from work and education. Television, music, and photography were outlawed. Public executions returned to the stadiums. The world watched in horror as centuries of culture were crushed under the weight of ideology. Yet within Afghanistan, some still supported them. After years of war and lawlessness, the Taliban had at least brought stability, however brutal. Meanwhile, far away, a new threat was taking shape. In the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, the Taliban gave sanctuary to a man named Osama bin Laden and his organization, Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden had fought in the jihad against the Soviets years earlier. Now he had turned his eyes toward a new enemy, the United States. From his Afghan base, he began plotting attacks on American targets around the world. In 1998, U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed. Hundreds died. President Bill Clinton responded with missile strikes on Afghan camps, but bin Laden escaped. 3 years later, his plans would reach their terrible conclusion. Chapter 7: September 11th and the Invasion. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda carried out the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the United States. It shocked the world. The Taliban did not carry out the attack, but they refused to hand over bin Laden when demanded. And for the U.S., that refusal was enough. On October 7, 2001, America and its allies launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Bombs rained down on Taliban strongholds. Within weeks, their regime collapsed. Kabul fell. Mullah Omar fled, and the Taliban, once feared and absolute, melted into the mountains. To many, it looked like victory. But Afghanistan's story was far from over. Chapter 8: The War That Never Ended. When the dust settled after the fall of the Taliban in 2001, the world celebrated what it thought was victory. In Kabul, people danced in the streets. Music returned. Girls walked to school again. And for the first time in years, the country felt a flicker of hope. But beneath that hope lay an old truth: Afghanistan had seen invaders come and go for centuries. Each thought they could build something that would last. Each believed they understood the land. None truly did. The United States and its allies promised a new beginning. They helped create a new constitution. They funded elections, schools, hospitals, and roads. Billions of dollars poured into the country. And for a time, it seemed as though Afghanistan might finally turn a corner. In December 2001, the Bonn Agreement was signed. It paved the way for an interim government led by Hamid Karzai, a man the West saw as a unifying figure, educated, pragmatic, and moderate. The plan was simple: stabilize Afghanistan, build its institutions, and train its own forces to protect its people. But Afghanistan is not a land that bends easily to plans. For every dollar spent, corruption found a pocket to fill. For every school built, a warlord demanded his share. And for every foreign soldier stationed in the cities, the mountains whispered reminders of the wars that had come before. Chapter 9. The Mountains Speak Again. In the southern provinces Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan, the Taliban was not gone. They had simply vanished into the countryside, crossing into Pakistan's tribal belt, regrouping, recruiting, and waiting. Many of their leaders found refuge in the Pakistani city of Quetta, where they reorganized into what became known as the Quetta Shura. There, under the quiet protection of sympathetic networks, the Taliban rebuilt itself piece by piece. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Waziristan, another movement began to grow: the Pakistani Taliban, inspired by their Afghan counterparts, but with their own agenda. It was clear that the border drawn more than a century earlier, the Durran Line, still meant nothing to the people who lived along it. By 2005, violence was spreading again. Roadside bombs, IEDs, appeared along dusty roads once thought safe. Suicide attacks became common. Foreign troops began dying in increasing numbers. And with each airstrike that killed civilians, more recruits joined the Taliban's ranks. The war was changing. The Taliban no longer fought in open fields. They fought from the shadows. They knew they could not match Western technology, so they used time instead. To the Taliban, time itself was a weapon. They could wait longer than any foreign army could stay. Chapter 10. The Western Struggle. In Washington, London, and Brussels, officials spoke confidently about rebuilding Afghanistan. But on the ground, soldiers began to realize that they were fighting ghosts. Convoys rolled out each morning under a rising sun that offered no warmth, only exposure. They would pass through villages where smiles hid fear, where silence spoke louder than words. Every dirt road, every culvert, every pile of rocks might hide an explosive. Every child waving could be a scout. Every shadow might be an ambush. By 2006, the Taliban had re-emerged across southern Afghanistan. Their attacks grew coordinated, disciplined, and deadly. They began to take territory again, not with armies, but with influence. They taxed farmers, mediated disputes, and enforced their version of justice. In many areas, the Afghan government existed only on paper. The Western military called it counterinsurgency. It was supposed to win hearts and minds, but hearts and minds cannot be bought. They must be believed in. And for many Afghans, belief in the government had already faded. While soldiers fought in the valleys, another war raged in the capital, a war of politics and corruption. Contracts meant to build schools and roads were siphoned off by elites. Foreign aid vanished before it ever reached the villages. Afghanistan was being rebuilt, yes, but unevenly, and in places, not at all. Chapter 11. The Return of the Fields. In the countryside, farmers turned back to what they knew best: poppy. Afghanistan had once again become the world's largest producer of opium. For many rural families, it was the only way to survive. And for the Taliban, it was the perfect way to fund their war. Western forces tried to eradicate the poppy fields, but this only deepened resentment. Farmers watched their livelihoods burn while corrupt officials continued to profit. The Taliban offered protection for a price and promised to let the crops grow. Many took the offer, and so the war became entangled with the drug trade. Opium money flowed into the hands of smugglers, warlords, and insurgents alike. It financed weapons, bribes, and propaganda. To the outside world, Afghanistan was a war against terror. To the people living it, it was a war for survival. Chapter 12. A New Generation of War. By 2009, the U.S. found itself fighting on two fronts, Iraq and Afghanistan. President Barack Obama called Afghanistan the necessary war. He promised to refocus, to finish what had begun in 2001. Tens of thousands of new troops were deployed. The surge, they called it. Operations intensified across Helmand and Kandahar. Entire districts were cleared of Taliban fighters, but only temporarily. Once the troops left, the Taliban returned. Villagers began to see a pattern. Foreign soldiers would arrive, promise safety, and then depart, leaving them exposed to Taliban retribution. Slowly, fear replaced faith. In 2011, the man responsible for 9/11s, Osama bin Laden, was found and killed in Abbottabad, Pakistan. For many Americans, it felt like closure. For Afghans, it changed little. The war dragged on. That same year, Mullah Omar, the founder of the Taliban, died in hiding. His death was kept secret for 2 years to prevent the movement from splintering. But the cracks had already begun to show. A new leader, Mullah Akhtar Mansour, took control. He tried to modernize the Taliban's image to combine politics with insurgency. He opened communication channels, rebranded the group as a nationalist movement rather than an international jihad. And it worked. By 2015, the Taliban was stronger than it had been in years. They were fighting the Afghan army in every province. Their black and white flags returned to checkpoints that had once been secured. The U.S. had spent hundreds of billions. Thousands of lives were lost. But Afghanistan's future remained uncertain. Chapter 13, The Long Goodbye. By the late 2010s, the world's attention began to drift away. Other crises took the headlines. None. The war in Afghanistan had become background noise, the forever war. Troop numbers were reduced. Airstrikes replaced ground patrols. The U.S. shifted its strategy from nation-building to simply maintaining control. In 2018, a quiet negotiation began in Doha, Qatar. For the first time, American diplomats sat across the table from the Taliban. The Afghan government was not even included at first. It was a sign of what was coming. The Taliban made promises. They would not allow terrorism to operate from Afghan soil again. They would engage in peace talks. They would respect certain rights under Islamic law. The U.S. in turn agreed to withdraw all troops. The deal was signed in February 2020. And with a single pen stroke, the longest war in American history began to end. Chapter 14, Collapse. As the last American troops prepared to leave, the Taliban moved faster than anyone imagined. In early 2021, they began capturing districts across the south. By July, entire provinces had fallen without a fight. Afghan soldiers, demoralized, unpaid, and abandoned, surrendered in droves. Local leaders switched allegiance to avoid bloodshed. The Taliban advanced with almost no resistance. By August, they had surrounded Kabul. The Afghan government pleaded for international support, but none came. On August 15, 2021, the president, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country. By evening, Taliban fighters had entered the capital. There was no battle, only disbelief. The world watched as helicopters evacuated diplomats from rooftops, an image eerily reminiscent of Saigon decades earlier. Crowds of desperate Afghans swarmed the airport, clinging to departing planes in panic. 20 years of war had come full circle. In a single day, the Taliban returned to power. Chapter 15, The New Emirate. The Taliban of 2021 was not the same as the Taliban of 1996, at least, not entirely. They spoke of amnesty. They gave interviews. They promised moderation. But beneath the polished speeches and press conferences, the old fears returned. Women were again told to stay home for their safety. Girls' schools were closed in many provinces. Television presenters were ordered to cover their faces. The Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice returned the same force that once patrolled streets with whips and sticks. In some areas, the Taliban showed restraint. In others, they did not. Executions, disappearances, and beatings returned quieter this time, but still there. For Afghans, it was déjà vu. For the world, it was a reckoning. Chapter 16. The Lessons of History. How did it happen? How did the most powerful military alliance in history spend 2 decades only for Afghanistan to end up back where it started? The answer lies not in a single failure, but in a chain of them. The Soviets had believed they could reshape Afghanistan through ideology. The Americans believed they could reshape it through democracy. But Afghanistan has never accepted foreign blueprints. Its strength lies in its resistance, its ability to outlast anyone who tries to claim it. Afghanistan was not defeated. It endured. It always has. Empires come and go. But Afghanistan remains, scarred but unbroken. Chapter 17. The Graveyard of Empires. The phrase has been repeated so often, it sounds like legend, the Graveyard of Empires. But it isn't myth. It's history. The British Empire entered twice and left in ruins. The Soviet Union invaded and collapsed within a decade. The United States came with technology the world had never seen and still could not hold it. Afghanistan does not defeat empires through armies or weapons. It defeats them through endurance, through the patience of its people, through the endless mountains that swallow ambition. It is a land where time moves differently, where decades of occupation can vanish in weeks of rebellion. And perhaps that is why it has never truly been conquered. Chapter 18. Echoes of Tomorrow. Today, Afghanistan stands at another crossroads. The Taliban rule once more. The foreign troops are gone. The embassies are empty. The world has turned its attention elsewhere. Yet the same questions remain. Will Afghanistan find peace? Can the Taliban change? And will the world remember what happened there, or will it only remember how it ended? For now, the mountains keep their secrets. The rivers flow past the ruins of old palaces and new checkpoints. Children still play in the dust, chasing kites through the same skies where warplanes once flew. Afghanistan endures as it always has, not just as a nation, but as a lesson. A lesson that power is temporary, that foreign armies leave, but consequences remain, that in the heart of Asia lies a land that cannot be tamed, only survived. Outro music rises from the great game of empires, to the Soviet invasion, to the rise, fall, and rise again of the Taliban. Afghanistan's story is not one of defeat. It is one of endurance. A reminder to the world that not every nation can be remade, and not every people will bow to the weight of history. This is the story of Afghanistan. This is the story of the Taliban. And it is far from over. Chapter 19. The Aftermath, a City of Ghosts. When Kabul fell on that August day in 2021, the world watched in real time. The images were surreal: men clinging to the wings of planes, mothers passing babies over barbed wire to foreign soldiers, people burning documents and photographs that could tie them to the old government. The war was over, but in many ways it had only changed form. Inside the city, the silence was almost unnatural. For 2 decades, Kabul had been noisy traffic, construction, music, and the hum of foreign languages in its streets. Now, the sound was different. The low rumble of pickup trucks filled with Taliban fighters, the echo of boots where once there had been laughter. The old government ministries were abandoned. The presidential palace, once the center of Western-backed power, was now occupied by men with long beards and rifles slung across their shoulders. They sat in the same chairs, in the same offices, beneath the same portraits of national heroes, but the air felt different. Reporters who had covered the war for years stood on rooftops, looking out over the capital, unable to find words. For them, it was as though the clock had turned back to 1996. But for the people of Afghanistan, for the men, women, and children who had lived through the years of occupation and conflict, it was something more complex. Some were afraid, some were relieved, and many were simply exhausted. The Taliban promised forgiveness. They promised stability. They promised that this time would be different. But promises in Afghanistan are like the wind, they shift with the mountains. Chapter 20. The new emirate begins. In the weeks after Kabul's fall, the Taliban announced the restoration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The old flag was lowered. The white banner of the emirate was raised once more. Mullah Hibatullah Akhundzada was declared Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful. But for months he was unseen. His voice was heard only through written statements read by others. The new government was a mixture of old and new faces, former Taliban commanders, younger spokesmen who spoke fluent English, and figures meant to signal moderation to the international community. But beneath the surface, the same ideological structure remained. Ministries were renamed. The Ministry for Women's Affairs was replaced by the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. The morality police returned to the streets, quietly at first, then more openly. Girls' schools were reopened briefly, then closed again. The Taliban said it was temporary, that they needed to create a safe Islamic environment for female education. Months passed. The doors stayed shut. Women were told they could work in healthcare, in education, in limited fields, but always under strict conditions. They could not travel without a male guardian. They could not appear on television without their faces covered. For the women who had once run businesses, studied abroad, or held office, it was a cruel reversal of 2 decades of progress. But the Taliban insisted they were not the same movement they once were. They spoke of amnesty, of discipline, of peace. They allowed journalists to film press conferences, to ask questions, though only within limits. The world listened, cautious but curious. Could the Taliban truly have changed? Or was this merely a quieter version of the same ideology, the calm before a storm? Chapter 21. The Price of Isolation. Recognition did not come. No major nation formally acknowledged the Taliban's rule. Without recognition came economic collapse. Foreign aid, which once made up 75% of Afghanistan's budget, vanished almost overnight. Banks froze. Salaries went unpaid. Food prices doubled, then tripled. Winter descended with empty shelves and colder homes. The UN warned of famine. Entire families began selling possessions, carpets, jewelry, even their own daughters, just to survive. It wasn't ideology that was killing Afghanistan now. It was hunger. Outside powers debated whether to release frozen Afghan assets, billions of dollars locked away in foreign banks. Some argued that releasing them would empower the Taliban. Others said withholding them would destroy the Afghan people. In the end, the debate dragged on while the people suffered in silence. By 2022, Afghanistan faced one of the worst humanitarian crises on earth. Half the population needed emergency aid. Children starved in mountain villages that no convoy could reach. In the streets of Kabul, men once proud to work as soldiers or teachers now begged for bread. The Taliban blamed the West. The West blamed the Taliban. And the people were caught, once again, between giants who did not hear their cries. Chapter 22. The Resistance Returns. In the north, whispers began again, the same region that had resisted the Taliban's first rule in the 1990s. The Panjshir Valley, narrow, mountainous, and defiant, once more became the heart of resistance. Ahmad Massoud, the son of the late Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary commander assassinated by Al-Qaeda just 2 days before 9/11 declared the formation of the National Resistance Front, NRF. He vowed that Panjshir would not bow. Fighters loyal to the old Afghan army joined him. For a brief moment, it seemed like history might repeat itself, a new Northern alliance rising from the ashes. But the Taliban moved quickly. With years of combat experience and control of American weapons left behind after the withdrawal, they advanced into the valley with speed and firepower. The resistance was crushed within weeks. The surviving fighters melted into the mountains. Still, they did not disappear. Across the northeast and along the borders with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, small bands of rebels continued to strike. They were not strong enough to reclaim cities, but strong enough to remind the Taliban that no rule in Afghanistan is ever total. In Afghanistan, even silence hides resistance. Chapter 23. The World's Cold Stare. Outside Afghanistan, the world's attention shifted elsewhere. Ukraine, the Middle East, the global economy. The war that had once dominated every headline faded into the background. Yet behind closed doors, intelligence agencies and humanitarian groups continued to watch. They saw that extremist groups ISIS-K, Al-Qaeda remnants, and other factions were regrouping within Afghanistan's borders. The Taliban denied it, but reports continued to surface: training camps, attacks, assassinations. The U.S., now operating from afar, carried out occasional drone strikes, surgical, secretive, and deniable. One such strike in 2022 killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, as he stood on the balcony of a safe house in Kabul. The Taliban claimed ignorance. The world was not convinced. Once again, Afghanistan had become what so many feared it would: a sanctuary for those too dangerous to exist anywhere else. But this time there was no invasion. No armies, no speeches, only quiet observation and the sound of a world that had moved on. Chapter 24. The Generation Left Behind. For the young people of Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban was not just a political shift, it was a collapse of identity. An entire generation had grown up knowing only one Afghanistan, connected to the world, online, educated, ambitious. Now, those same young men and women watched as their future dissolved overnight. Teachers who had once taught in English now sat at home, forbidden to return to class. Girls who dreamed of becoming doctors or engineers found their schools closed and their textbooks confiscated. Athletes, musicians, journalists, the faces of a new Afghanistan fled by the thousands. Those who couldn't leave faced a quieter kind of exile, trapped in their own country. In Kabul's cafes, once filled with students discussing ideas, the chairs stood empty. Internet cafes that had buzzed with conversation now glowed dimly in the dark. Every day, another light went out, but not everyone accepted it. Secret schools reappeared, hidden in basements and behind curtains. Women taught girls in whispers, just as they had under the first Taliban regime. They knew the risk. They did it anyway, because Afghanistan's greatest rebellion has always been its people's refusal to stop dreaming, even when dreams are forbidden. Chapter 25. Between Past and Future. The Taliban's leaders insist that they are different now. They say they have learned from the past, that they want good relations with the world, that they seek recognition and trade, not isolation. They have allowed some aid agencies to operate. They have tolerated limited media, though under close watch. But at their core, they remain what they have always been: a movement built on control, on faith interpreted as law, on certainty that does not bend. Yet Afghanistan itself is changing, quietly and inevitably. Technology has crept into every valley. Young Afghans, even under censorship, still find ways to see the world beyond their borders through VPNs, through satellite signals, through smuggled phones. They are connected in ways the Taliban cannot fully stop. The battle for Afghanistan's future is no longer only fought with guns. It is fought with ideas, with information, with access. And that battle, unlike the others, cannot be won by force alone. Chapter 26. The Human Cost. More than 200,000 Afghans have died since 2001. Soldiers, civilians, insurgents, and innocents. Entire villages have vanished. Fields once green with wheat and poppy lie barren, seeded only with mines. Nearly half of Afghanistan's population now lives in poverty. Children grow up knowing hunger as normal. Hospitals struggle with no medicine, no funding, and no power. Earthquakes, floods, and droughts compound the suffering. And yet in the face of all this, the Afghan people endure. They rebuild. They adapt. They survive. In the markets of Kabul, vendors still open their stalls. Children still fly kites against the skyline, laughing even as the power flickers out. For every headline that declares Afghanistan lost, there are 1,000 small acts of courage, unseen. A teacher opening a hidden classroom, a mother keeping her family fed, a doctor working by candlelight. That is Afghanistan, not the wars, not the regimes, but the resilience that survives them all. Chapter 27. The World's Lesson. In the halls of power in Washington, London, and Moscow, Afghanistan's name is now spoken less often, but its shadow lingers. It remains a warning carved into the history of nations that thought they could change it. Empires learn slowly. Afghanistan teaches quickly. It taught the British that pride has a price. It taught the Soviets that ideology cannot conquer geography. And it taught the Americans that victory is not the same as peace. The cost of misunderstanding. Afghanistan has always been high measured not just in dollars or strategy, but in lives. In the faces of the children who grew up in the ruins of other men's ambitions. It is easy to start a war in Afghanistan. It is impossible to finish one. Chapter 28. Hope in the Ashes. Still, even now, hope survives in the smallest corners. In Herat, a group of women founded an underground library, thousands of books hidden from the eyes of the authorities. They read by candlelight, teaching younger girls about the world beyond the walls. In Bamiyan, artists paint murals over the ruins of the Buddhas the Taliban once destroyed, art born from absence. In Mazar-e-Sharif, children play football on the same ground where their fathers once fought. In the valleys of the north, men plant trees where graves once stood. Life continues fragile, defiant, unstoppable. The Taliban may control the government, but they do not control the spirit of the Afghan people. That spirit has survived kings, empires, invasions, and revolutions. It will survive this, too. Chapter 29. The Cycle of History. The story of Afghanistan has never truly been about war. It is about time, the endless turning of the same wheel. Foreign powers come believing they can end the cycle. But Afghanistan does not end. It continues. It bends history to its will, reshaping those who enter it. The British left with broken pride. The Soviets left with broken ideology. The Americans left with broken promises. And yet through all of it, Afghanistan remained scarred, yes, but still itself. In that, there is a strange kind of victory, not for governments or generals, but for the soil itself, for the people who refused to be erased. Chapter 30. The Final Word. In the quiet hours of the morning, when Kabul sleeps under a thin veil of dust, you can still hear echoes of all that has passed. The laughter of children learning to read in secret. The distant call to prayer. The low rumble of a truck on an empty road. And somewhere beyond the hills, the whisper of history repeating itself. Afghanistan does not forget. It endures. Empires fall. Leaders rise and vanish. But the mountains remain. and in their shadows life begins again, uncertain, fragile, but always reborn. Outro narration. This is Afghanistan, a nation not of defeat, but of endurance, a land that teaches the world what it refuses to learn. That power fades, that pride blinds, that people survive. The story of Afghanistan is the story of resistance, to empire, to ideology, to time itself. And perhaps that is why, after all these years, it still haunts us, because in its endurance, Afghanistan holds up a mirror to the world and asks every nation the same question: what would you sacrifice to remain free? Chapter 31. The World That Left and the Land That Stayed. For 20 years, Afghanistan was the center of the world's attention. Every speech, every summit, every promise seemed to orbit around it. Politicians in Washington and London called it a mission of freedom. Generals spoke of democracy. Journalists spoke of liberation. But when the cameras left, Afghanistan remained what it had always been, a land too complex for headlines and too ancient for slogans. When the last foreign plane departed in August 2021, silence fell across airfields once filled with noise. It was the sound of a chapter closing, not with victory, not with defeat, but with exhaustion. Those who stayed behind were left to navigate a reality shaped by 2 decades of foreign dreams and internal struggles. Those who left carried memories heavier than their luggage, the streets they'd grown up on, the faces they'd left behind, the hopes they weren't sure they'd ever see again. In refugee camps across Iran, Pakistan, and beyond, Afghan families started over, again. Fathers searched for work in foreign cities. Mothers waited for letters that never came. Children grew up speaking new languages, but dreaming in the old one. And back home, those who stayed carried on. Because in Afghanistan, survival is not an act of courage. It is an instinct. Chapter 32. The War Within. Every war has its front lines. Some are visible trenches, checkpoints, cities under siege. Others are invisible hearts, beliefs, the war between the past and the future. The new Afghanistan was fighting a war of memory. For older generations, the Taliban's return brought back the ghosts of the 1990s, the days of silence, of fear, of hiding radios under blankets. For the younger ones, it was confusion, a clash between what they'd been told was possible and what reality had become. Social media, once alive with voices of progress and debate, turned into whispers and coded language. Hashtags were replaced by silence. Profiles disappeared overnight, and yet the war of memory continued quietly. Afghan women recorded video diaries, speaking to the world through VPNs and hidden cameras. Teachers kept attendance lists in notebooks labeled as recipe books. Musicians recorded songs in secret, their melodies smuggled out on USB drives. Afghanistan has always fought its wars with weapons. Now, it fought one with memory, the simple refusal to forget what freedom felt like. Chapter 33. The Outside Looking In. From the outside, the world debated what went wrong. How did 20 years of effort collapse in 11 days? How did the most powerful alliance in history fail to build something that could stand on its own? The answers were many and none. Some blamed corruption, some blamed impatience, some blamed geography itself. But perhaps the truth lies in a single misunderstanding, the belief that Afghanistan could be rebuilt in someone else's image. Foreign nations tried to bring democracy. Afghanistan's people wanted dignity. They tried to bring order. The people wanted respect. They tried to bring modernity. The people wanted survival. The gap between those worlds was never bridged. For years, soldiers patrolled valleys they did not understand. Diplomats wrote policies for cities they'd never walked through. and contractors built schools that would be destroyed before the paint dried. It wasn't a lack of effort, it was a lack of comprehension. To understand Afghanistan, one must understand its pain and its pride, and that no army or government can teach. Chapter 34, The Invisible Empire. History calls Afghanistan the graveyard of empires, but perhaps that title misses the point. Empires do not die in Afghanistan. They reveal themselves. The British Empire entered with rifles and arrogance. It left with broken pride. The Soviet Union arrived with tanks and ideology. It left with shattered illusions. The United States came with technology and faith in democracy. It left with questions it still cannot answer. In each case, the same thing happened. Afghanistan did not change them by force. It changed them by reflection. It held up a mirror. To the British, it showed the limits of imperial reach. To the Soviets, it showed the limits of political control. To the Americans, it showed the limits of nation building. In trying to conquer Afghanistan, each empire discovered what it feared most itself. Chapter 35, The Women of Afghanistan. If there is one group that carries the weight of Afghanistan's history more than any other, it is its women. Throughout every era, from monarchy to communism, from occupation to emirate, Afghan women have stood at the heart of both progress and oppression. In Kabul during the 1960s, women walked freely in the streets, attended universities, and worked in offices. Photographs from that era show young students in skirts, smiling beside books and cafes. For a moment, it seemed as though Afghanistan might follow the path of modern nations. Then came war, then ideology, then foreign armies. Each promised liberation, yet each left the same scars. In the 1990s, the Taliban silenced women's voices completely. In the 2000s, they returned doctors, pilots, journalists, parliamentarians. And in 2021, many of those same women watched it all vanish overnight. Yet even now, they persist. In small acts that seem invisible to the outside world, Afghan women continue to resist by teaching in secret, by writing, by simply refusing to disappear. They are the quiet heartbeat of a nation the world often misjudges. And one day, when Afghanistan rises again, it will be because of them. Chapter 36, The Children of War. A child born in Afghanistan in 2001, the year the U.S. invaded, came of age as the U.S. withdrew. Their entire life has been shaped by war. They grew up with the hum of drones above their villages, the echo of explosions in the distance, and the sight of soldiers speaking languages they didn't understand. Many have never known what peace feels like. But these same children also carry resilience beyond their years. They have learned to navigate chaos with grace, to rebuild what has been broken, to dream in the face of despair. Some of them now sit behind cameras, documenting the truth their parents could never show. Others have left, building lives abroad but carrying their homeland in every heartbeat. They are Afghanistan's future, a generation scarred by conflict, but not defined by it. And though they were born in war, many of them will be the ones to build peace. Chapter 37, The Haunting of the West. For the West, the fall of Kabul was not just a political event, it was a psychological one. It forced nations to confront uncomfortable truths about power, purpose, and pride. In Washington, hearings were held, reports written, generals questioned. Who was to blame? Who miscalculated? Who failed? But no report could explain what was visible in every soldier's eyes as they boarded the last planes home, the sense that something larger had slipped through their fingers. The United States had spent trillions, trained armies, built institutions. And yet, when the time came, it all vanished in days. For many veterans, the war did not end when they left Afghanistan. It stayed with them in dreams, in silence, in memories they could not explain. They had fought for villages that no longer existed. They had seen sacrifice measured in seconds. Afghanistan became their ghost, a chapter that never really closed. Chapter 38, The Waiting Game. The Taliban's leaders now face the same question every ruler of Afghanistan has faced. Can they hold a country that does not wish to be held? They have the guns. They have the power. But power in Afghanistan is like water. It flows, it erodes, it slips through the hands of those who think they can contain it. As of 2023, the Taliban remain in control. But control in Afghanistan is never absolute. Beneath the surface, old alliances shift, ethnic tensions simmer. Economic desperation grows. Even within the Taliban itself, fractures are visible between hardliners who want isolation and pragmatists who seek engagement with the world. Their future depends on which side prevails. Because Afghanistan's story is not static. It never has been. It changes shape with every generation, every war, every storm that sweeps across its mountains. Chapter 39. The Silence of the Mountains. The mountains of Afghanistan have seen everything: armies, revolutions, dreams. They have watched men build cities and destroy them, swear peace and break it, invade and retreat. And still they stand ancient, unmoved, indifferent. From the peaks of the Hindu Kush, the country looks eternal, endless valleys fading into haze, rivers carving the same paths they have carved for 1,000 years. It is only humans who change, who burn and rebuild, who live and die believing they can shape what was here long before them. At dusk, shepherds still lead their flocks along paths where tanks once rolled. Children chase kites in the same wind that carried smoke from wars long past. The sky turns red over Kabul, and for a moment everything feels suspended, fragile, but alive. That is the paradox of Afghanistan. Even in ruin, it breathes. Chapter 40. The Legacy of Endurance. What does it mean to endure? For Afghanistan, endurance is not survival, it is defiance. It is the refusal to vanish, no matter how many times the world writes its obituary. Every empire that has entered Afghanistan has left believing it could change the land. None understood that Afghanistan was changing them instead. It teaches patience to the impatient, humility to the powerful, and perspective to those who believe history is linear. Because here, history is circular. Every invasion, every collapse, every promise, all of it echoes, repeats, evolves. Afghanistan's endurance is not measured in victories. It is measured in continuance. The fact that after centuries of invasion and war, its people still speak the same languages, tell the same stories, and pray under the same sky, that is endurance. Chapter 41. The question that remains. What is Afghanistan now? A nation rebuilding or a nation waiting? A success or a tragedy? A warning or a lesson? Perhaps it is all of these and none of them. To outsiders, Afghanistan is a headline that comes and goes. To those who live there, it is a heartbeat that never stops. It is not a land defined by failure, but by persistence. It does not seek pity, only understanding. Afghanistan does not ask the world to save it. It asks the world to remember it truthfully, fully, without distortion. Not as a graveyard, but as a mirror. Because somewhere within its story lies a truth every nation must face, that freedom cannot be given, peace cannot be imposed, and faith in any form cannot be forced. Chapter 42. The final scene. Night falls over Kabul. The city glows faintly under scattered lights. The call to prayer drifts through the air, soft and timeless. Somewhere a generator hums. Somewhere else a child dreams. The war may be over, but its echoes remain in the cracks of the streets, in the silence of empty schools, in the memories of those who lived through it all. Afghanistan sleeps, but never deeply. Its history is too loud, too restless. The world has moved on, but the story continues as it always does here, where endings are just beginnings wearing different faces. For centuries, foreign flags have risen and fallen over this land. But the Afghan sky remains untouched. It belongs to no one. And perhaps that is Afghanistan's greatest victory. Not in conquest, not in control, but in the simple, unbreakable truth that no one ever truly owns it. This is Afghanistan, a nation carved by mountains and molded by endurance. A story of faith and survival, of tragedy and beauty intertwined. The world may forget its wars, but Afghanistan remembers, always, because history does not end here. It waits, and someday it will rise again.